On this episode of Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, join me as I take a dive into the case of the two British backpackers who drove across Australia with only one coming home. Coming up right after this. Hello, guys. Welcome to Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans. I'm your host, Belinda Brady, and welcome, my true crime friends. I hope you guys are all doing well, and I hope life has been good to you since we last caught up. And thank you for listening, of course. So, straight up, for those who are just joining this podcast, my name is Belinda Brady. I am your host. This is my podcast where I talk to you about crime while I drink coffee. And that is the premise. That is it. That's my podcast. And I like to think of it as I'm having a conversation with people about crime over coffee. So I hope that is how it comes across. Now, straight up, I always like to do a little around the grounds of where you guys are listening to me from. And at the moment, I've got people listening to me from Turkey, from Germany, from Ireland, and from Dubai. That is insane. I absolutely love that, guys. Thank you. Keep it up. Love to see it. And I've had a look. I've also got some from Greece, France, and Costa Rica. That absolutely blows my mind, guys. I love it. Thank you so much. Now, what am I drinking as I talk to you? Well, at this point in time, as I record this, we're at the tail end of summer and she's going out with a fight. It is so hot. It is so humid, but I still can't quite bring myself to get an iced coffee. So I have a hot latte. I got it from Macca's drive-thru. I love their coffees. It is what it is. And so I'm just having a flat large latte. That doesn't even make sense. Belinda, I'm having a large latte. And for those not familiar with our Aussie slang, Macca's is slang for McDonald's. So I have a large coffee from McDonald's drive-thru. Now, you can subscribe to me on YouTube. You can subscribe to me on my Buzzsprout website. You can buy me a coffee. You can leave me feedback any which way you want to, by text, by YouTube, by the website, or you can find me on TikTok, guys. I am very reachable for all of you. And if you do subscribe, you get bonus episodes, which are ghost stories. And I'm not going to pick the obvious ghost stories for you guys. I'll be taking a deep dive into the haunted country that is Australia, and I would love it if you could join me. So please subscribe. Okay, enough of that. My sources for this episode: bbc.com.news, murderpedia.org, news.com.au, theguardian.com, abcnet.au, Clant, which is clant.org.au, theguardian.com, and that is it. So settle in, guys, however you're listening to me. Driving, gymming, walking, working, having a coffee, settle in and let's get into the episode, which I have titled The Murder of Peter Falconio. Now, as is the case with many countries around the world, Australia is a popular place for tourists from all over to travel and explore. And like other places, most of those who come here to explore our great southern land go off the beaten track. And they do this so they can see every bit of it as they can, and I totally get it. And I'm sure there are many tourists out there who have seen more of Australia than I have. And, you know, at any given moment, Australia is swarming with backpackers. I was in Sydney not long ago and I could not believe the number of tourists that were around the place. It's amazing to see so many tourists in Australia at the moment. And at any given time, they are traveling far and wide. Now, back in 2001, this was a British couple by the name of Peter Falconio and his girlfriend Joanne. Now, they both hailed from Yorkshire, which is a beautiful part of England. who hired a van to travel throughout the outback. And if you've listened to my previous podcast episodes about the backpackers who were murdered by serial killer Ivan Milat, one of these Brits met the same grisly fate. Now, Peter Marco Falconio was born on the 20th of September 1972 and was the third of four sons who lived in Hepworth, West Riding of Yorkshire in the United Kingdom. In 1996, he met Joanne Lees in a nightclub in Huddersfield, and they hit it off. Now, Joanne Lees was born on the 25th of September 1973 and lived with her mother, Jenny, and for the first 11 years of her life, it was only her and her mum. Her mother then remarried a man called Vincent, who had a son called Sam, and the four lived together. Now, she had several part-time jobs before scoring a job at her local travel agency, which was called Thomas Cook. Now, after her and Peter met in 1996, they moved in together and lived in Brighton. Now, the couple took several trips to Italy, Greece, and Jamaica. And in 1998, the couple had planned a trip to Thailand and Singapore and Australia. Though the recent Port Arthur massacre and the backpacker murders had their families really, really nervous, and they advised them against travelling to Australia at that time. But in November 2000, the couple departed the UK and they travelled throughout Nepal, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand and Cambodia. On the 16th of January 2001, Peter and Joanne arrived in Sydney on a working holiday visa, which is a visa that allows travellers a certain amount of time to work in Australia, and therefore they can support themselves while travelling around. And as a result of this, Joanne scored herself a job at Dimmick's bookstore on George Street, which is one of my all-time favourite bookstores. You could spend a whole day in there just getting lost amongst the books. But I digress, as I do. Now, the two spent the next 5 or so months enjoying the Sydney nightclub scene and all Sydney had to offer before they headed off for the next part of their adventure. They were going to travel throughout the outback. Now, Peter and Joanne left Sydney on the 25th of June 2001 in the orange Kombi they had purchased for their road trip. Now, the two arrived in the Northern Territory. So the Northern Territory is a separate state. So from Sydney to the Northern Territory is a decent drive. It's a different state and it's very isolated, and think outback, think orange dirt. That's what you're getting when you get to the Northern Territory. So they had arrived in the Northern Territory and were on the Stewart Highway, which is a major highway that runs between the Northern Territory and another state called South Australia. And it measures a distance of a whopping 2,720 kilometres or 1,690 miles. They were making their way to a tourist attraction which is called the Devil's Marbles, which is a protected reserve located in the Northern Territory. And basically the Devil's Marbles are two massive boulders and is of great significance in the Aboriginal community. They're beautiful. Do yourself a favour, Google a picture. They're impressive. They are very, very beautiful. Now, it was Saturday the 14th of July 2001 at around 7:30 p.m. and both Joanne and Peter were aware of a car that had been following them and had been following them since they stopped at a roadhouse in Barrow Creek. So the car had been following them for quite some time and they expected this car to overtake them, but it didn't. Now, the car that was following them, which was a white Toyota four-wheel drive with a green canopy, ended up driving up alongside them, gesturing for Peter, who was driving, to pull over. So they did. Peter pulled over and got out of the Kombi and went to the front of the car to talk to the man in the four-wheel drive who had just motioned for them to pull over. Now, the man had told them that he had seen sparks coming out of their exhaust and they should check it out. So Peter and this man walked to the back of the combi, and meanwhile Joanne, who had been in the passenger seat, climbed into the driver's seat, ready to rev the engine when asked. What she heard, instead of Peter asking her to give the engine a rev, was a loud bang. And seconds later, the man appeared at her window holding a silver handgun. He then climbed into the van, pointing the gun at her temple, where he told her to put her head down and her hands behind her back. Joanne was then dragged into the gunman's car, which was the canopy. So she was dragged into the back of the canopy with a dog that was in the car. I believe the dog might have been a Kelpie, where she fell to the ground at one stage and scraped herself, and she was screaming for Peter. She was also struggling with the man who was trying to tape her legs together, which he didn't end up doing. Now, he shoved her in the back of the car into the canopy part. And while she was in there, Joanne heard a noise like gravel scraping on the ground, like something was being moved. Now, Joanne was in flight or fight mode, as you absolutely would be. So while this man was away dragging what I'm going to assume was Peter's body away. So while this was going on, Joanne managed to sit upright in the tray of the car and slide forward with her feet towards the rear of the Utes cabin. And she saw an opening, like a little opening. So she hung her legs over the edge and made a run for it as soon as her feet hit the ground. She heard the crunch of the gravel underneath her feet as soon as she jumped out of this car, but she knew she had to hide, as there was no way she could outrun this man, this armed man. It was pitch black at this point. It was winter and absolutely pitch black, and Joanne was running using nothing but instinct. And I've never been to the Northern Territory, I've never been to the Outback, but I imagine it would be so black out there over night time you wouldn't be able to see the hand in front of your face. So this poor girl was running on nothing but instinct to survive, and she found a bush and kind of curled herself up into a ball, using her black hair to cover her knees so she blended in with the blackness. Now, this man was looking for her along with his dog, and he came close. A few times she could hear him getting really close to her, but she had to slow down her breathing so he couldn't hear her. And in amongst all this, she could still hear him dragging something. So she heard a car take off while she was still hiding. But moments later, one came back, and this time he had a torch. Now, after looking for her for a bit longer, this second car drove off, and after a few moments of sitting there in the black, curled behind a bush, the fear of God put into you, like fearing if I make one wrong move, I'm going to die. She decided the coast was clear and made a run for it. Now, Joanne managed to flag down a road train driver who, along with his co-driver, helped untie her and drove her to Barrow Creek to get help. So Barrow Creek was a nearby suburb, and this was at around 12:35 a.m. The Alice Springs police were called at around 1:30 a.m. and arrived to talk to Joanne and collect any evidence. At around 7 a.m., they went to the scene to look for Peter and any signs of the gunman. There they found a dirt-covered pool of blood and the orange combi van hidden in the scrub. And at some point, police also called in Aboriginal trackers to see if they could find Peter, but they were unable to find a body. Now, given the lack of evidence such as Peter's body and the nature of the attack, it was unwitnessed, it was out in the middle of nowhere, The police took a few days to appreciate the significance of this crime that had been reported. Hell, they didn't even close the highway until, like, I think it was 12 hours after Joanne had made that report. Now, after the backpacker murders and the attention that received, media were really quick to jump on this story, and of course, they were very quick to sensationalize Joanne's versions of events. Now, police held a press conference a few days after the attack, and I remember this press conference vividly. And I remember at the time thinking she was like a deer in headlights. The poor girl had been through a horrible trauma and was still probably trying to process it. And she'd just been shoved in front of the world stage. She was also wearing a t-shirt that read "Cheeky Monkey" across her front, and that combined with her cool demeanor, again, like deer in headlights, the poor girl was probably terrified, ensured the public turned on her, and they turned on her very quickly. Just like they did with Lindy Chamberlain, the mother who was wrongfully jailed when a dingo did in fact eat her baby or take her baby. Now, Lindy, this was before my time, but my mum was around. Well, my mum still is around, but my mum remembers this very vividly. And I asked her about it, and her words were, quite simply, we all thought she was guilty. And I dare say that was thanks to Lindy's trial by media. She was treated horribly. Public opinion about her was vile. And yeah, the same thing was now happening to Joanne. And I dare say I will be covering Lindy Chamberlain later on down the track. So do keep an eye out. And yeah, thanks to the media, Lindy was treated horribly. And all these years, later, Joanne was now experiencing the same thing. In 2001, we were still giving this poor woman the horrible treatment rather than giving her the benefit of the doubt. Now, Joanne eventually returned to the UK at the end of 2001, but she never gave up her search for Peter. She gave interviews. She released a book with her version of events just so she could keep Peter's story in the public eye. Now, meanwhile, there was no sign of Peter and no sign of the attacker. But police did obtain CCTV footage from the Roadhouse, the service station that Joanne and Peter had visited before the attack, with the suspected attacker in the white ute with the green canopy, hopping into his car and following. And they released that footage to the world, hoping for a lead, but nothing came forward. But they also managed to get some male DNA from Joanne's t-shirt, the cable ties that she was tied up with, and the Combi van's gear stick. And rewards were offered up to $250,000 for any information. And Joanne, of course, continued to be crucified by the press and public opinion. Now, while all this was happening, police focused on the registered owners of the Toyota Land Cruiser four-wheel drive. So anyone who owned a car like that and was registered to own that car was interviewed. And they eventually narrowed down their search to one man after many interviews, after many investigations. And the one man on their radar was Bradley John Murdoch. So police called him in for an interview in November of 2001, but Joanne's description of him didn't match up, and the police, for whatever reason, didn't take any DNA off him. Now, Bradley disappeared off the radar for a while, but he soon popped back up on it because he was arrested and charged for kidnap and rape in South Australia not long after. In 2003, a South Australian court heard how a mother and her 12-year-old daughter were kidnapped from their Riverland home, bound, gagged, and sexually assaulted for 20 hours. This poor mother feared her daughter and herself would not survive the ordeal, And she told the court after the trailer was packed up, he sat near the trailer staring at us. I didn't know if he was going to let us go or not. Now, the attack occurred in August of 2002, and Bradley had been a regular guest at the Riverland house, and the mother and Bradley had known each other for around 18 months. Now, Bradley had used the guest house at the back of the property as a base to run his drug running operations. Yes, he was a drug mule between South Australia and Western Australia. Now, at around the time he attacked the mother and daughter, he had heavily been using amphetamines and cannabis daily. And he had blacked out with black plastic the windows of the flat, so his paranoia was through the roof. Now, he lured this young girl to the flat with the premise of helping him unpack maps, but when she got there, he attacked her and raped her before carrying her out to his Land Cruiser, chaining her up and going to get her mother from the house. Now, when asked, "Why are you doing this to us?" he replied, "You were in the wrong place at the wrong time." He also claimed that he was being framed for the murder of Peter Falconio because he knew that he was a suspect at this point, and that is why he was on the run. Now, he saw the little girl and her mother as insurance to get out of his situation, I guess. I don't know how he came to that conclusion, but like I said, his paranoia was through the roof. Now, Bradley drove off with the mother and daughter in the back of his ute and eventually dropped them off at Port Augusta, which is another suburb in South Australia, and he dropped them off at a service station, giving them $1,000 to get home. He also left them with a threat that he would kill them if they went to the police. Now, the mother took her and her daughter to a nearby hospital where they were examined and cared for, but it would be 5 days before a police report was made. Bradley was eventually arrested in a supermarket in Port Augusta and was remanded in custody until the trial, for which he was eventually acquitted. Now, when he left the court for the rape and assault of a 12-year-old girl and her mother, Bradley Murdoch was swooped upon by police yet again, only this time he was arrested for the murder of Peter Falconio and the abduction of Joanne Lees. And I remember this too. It was massive news. Now, how this came to be was in 2002, police had caught up with Bradley's drug running accomplice. These guys very rarely work on their own, who had opened up about Bradley's connection to the Peter Falconio murder. And just 3 days before Bradley arrived in Riverland, South Australia, his brother had given DNA to the authorities because they didn't get DNA off Bradley when they had interviewed him. The blood found on Joanne Lee's clothing matched the Murdoch family DNA. The police had their smoking gun, and Joanne and Peter's family might finally get some answers about what had happened to Peter. And when Joanne had been shown a photo of Bradley, she immediately ID'd him as her attacker. So before I go any further, who was Bradley Murdoch? He was not a nice person. Bradley Murdoch was born in 1958 in Western Australia, the third son to parents Colin and Nancy. Bradley had a troubled younger life and was involved in bikie gangs and soon moved on to crime from the age of 15. He married in 1980 and had a son, but his wife left him thanks to his penchant for domestic violence, and he then turned his hand to truck driving and smuggling drugs. He was caught smuggling large amounts of marijuana and was jailed. And in 1988, he was still running drugs and running them between Western Australia and South Australia. In 1980, at the age of 22, he hit and killed a motorcyclist in Port Prairie in South Australia, where he received a suspended sentence. And in 1995, he was jailed for 21 months for shooting at people who were doing nothing more than celebrating an AFL Grand Final match in Fitzroy Crossing, Western Australia. He then raped and assaulted the mother and daughter in South Australia and was arrested for murder of Peter Falconio as he left the courthouse for that case. So yeah, he's not a nice guy. Bradley was extradited to the Northern Territory and DNA was taken from him. And yes, it matched the DNA on Joanne's shirt. And despite this evidence, he still maintained his innocence. Now, the murder trial commenced on the 25th of October in 2005, and Joanne Lees was in attendance. Bradley's defense stated that he was along a track called the Tanami track, which was nowhere near where the attack took place, so it couldn't have possibly been Bradley. And they also went on to attack Joanne, of course, where they managed to drag up that Joanne had cheated on Peter while she was in Sydney before the couple left for the Northern Territory. I mean, who cares? And they did this. It's just so vile that they did this. They dragged it up. So she had to admit that she had cheated on Peter, and they were trying to paint her as a untrustworthy witness. Now, Bradley also tried to argue that the DNA on Joanne's shirt might have transferred to that shirt because they had all visited the same Red Rooster in the vicinity, and Bradley had cut his hand, like he'd cut himself, and he had bled. His defense tried to tell the court that his blood on her shirt had transferred from her somehow coming in contact with his blood in the Red Rooster restaurant. And Red Rooster, for those who don't know, is a chicken restaurant, like takeaway, like Kentucky Fried Chicken. And his theory was that, he'd been bleeding in there and somehow she's come into contact with that blood. He was also presented with a hair tie that had been found on his shoulder holster, and he actually physically recoiled when he was presented with it. And he also denied that he denied that it belonged to Joanne. Now, Joanne was a sterling witness. She never faltered. She detailed being bound, threatened, and how Bradley had punched her in the head when he had abducted her. She told of hiding in the scrub as Bradley and his dog looked for her in the dark. She told of her escape and how she recognized Bradley from a photo the police had shown her. And when asked by the public prosecutor if she could see the man responsible for her abduction, Joanne looked straight at Bradley and said, "Yes, I'm looking at him." She also told the court of her ordeal during the attack, saying, "I just kept thinking, this isn't happening to me. I can't believe this is happening. And I felt alone. I kept shouting for Pete. I thought I was going to die, but I mainly just kept thinking, I can't believe this is happening." On the 13th of December, Bradley Murdoch was found guilty of Peter Falconio's murder and was sentenced to life in jail with a non-parole period of 28 years. He was also convicted of the assault on Joanne Lees. He gave no reason for doing what he did, and the only theory really being was that maybe this couple had come across him in the middle of a drug run and he was on some kind of drug-fueled rage bender. Now, Bradley launched an appeal on the grounds that Joanne's evidence was tainted, as she had seen a pic of him on the internet before the police had showed it to her, but that was dismissed. He launched another appeal in 2013, but that was also withdrawn. Bradley Murdoch stayed in the Berrimah prison on the outskirts of Darwin before he was eventually diagnosed with terminal throat cancer in 2019 and started receiving chemotherapy. He was released from prison into palliative care at Alice Springs Hospital in June 2025, where he died there on the 15th of July 2025, aged 67. Peter's family told the media that they felt like a weight had been lifted when they heard the news of his death. He never gave up the location of Peter Falconio's body. Today, Joanne Lees is living in the UK, working as a social worker and avoiding the spotlight. She has not married and has not had any kids, and she has connected with a half sister, a woman named Jess, who lives in Australia, and she's pursuing Australian citizenship. Now, she told the Daily Telegraph, which is an Australian newspaper, that meeting Jess had helped her feel less alone in the world. She still keeps in touch with Peter Falconio's family, and both are hopeful that Peter's remains will eventually be found so he can be finally laid to rest. In 2025, the Northern Territory government announced it will be holding a coronial inquest into the death of Peter Falconio. So that's it, guys. The story of a British couple who wanted nothing more than to see Australia and unfortunately cross paths with an absolute psycho. And if anyone listening does know any information, no matter how big or small, on the whereabouts of Peter Falconio's body, please let authorities know. Please let his family and Joanne finally put him to rest. My heart goes out to Peter Falconio's family for their loss, and my heart also goes out to Joanne Lees for her loss and for what she's had to endure. And that is it, guys. Thank you for listening. As always, I appreciate every single one of you, and until next time, stay safe, stay cool, stay caffeinated, and I will catch you all later.